Welcome back to the Un Holier Podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Smith. Today's episode is one I've really been looking forward to sharing with you. We're diving into a topic that's deeply meaningful, widely debated, and often misunderstood: Bible translations, with a special focus on the King James Version. For many people, the KJV isn't just a book, it's a tradition, history, and the literal foundation of their faith wrapped into one. But what happens when we slow down and examine how different versions came to be? What was translated, what may have been altered, and what sometimes gets overlooked? In this episode, I am joined by Justin, an expert who has spent years studying the intricacies and the fallacies of various Bible translations. He presents historical context, linguistic evidence, and the documentation that challenges some commonly held assumptions, particularly around the King James Version. Now, just to be clear, this conversation isn't about attacking faith or telling anyone what to believe. It's just about understanding the text, the process, and the history behind the words that have shaped millions of lives. So whether you're deeply religious, spiritually curious, or simply interested in history and truth-seeking, I encourage you to listen with an open mind. So let's get started. Hey, Justin, welcome to the podcast. So good
I
to
am
have you
excited
here.
to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. I mean, you are pretty much a legend in a lot of people's minds.
Oh no. They say don't meet your heroes, so I try to make it good.
Honestly, like I told you this before, you are now my new pastor, even though you didn't know it. Like this whole time, I've just been watching you on Sundays on your lives debate Christians, because I am learning more about the Bible and about history and everything than I did in all my years in the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, which is crazy because I come from a very long line of pastors, and I have all the credentials, Justin. I mean, I went to Bob Jones University.
That's tops.
I went to Bob Jones University. And then I decided to switch my major and switch my college my senior year due to the breakup over the King James Bible, which
Right, yeah.
yeah. For those that don't know, I was in a very serious relationship with my college sweetheart. We were nearly engaged, well, we pretty much were. We had the wedding date, the dress, everything. He just hadn't proposed yet. And my dad made us break up over this very issue that we were talking about today, the King James Version only Bibles. So I transferred to West Coast Baptist College because, I mean, why not just go to another unaccredited university?
Jesus didn't have any accreditation.
Oh my gosh, that's so true.
There's so many excuses for why their institutions don't have any actual educational standards, but they always point to, well, the disciples were just dumb fishermen.
Right, exactly. And I mean, Matthew, right? Was it Matthew? He was the tax collector. So he was like a heathen in and of itself. He was working for the IRS before the IRS was even. So, you got a whole group of people that just are not qualified, but God will qualify them.
I'm
Um,
shocked that the KJV crowd don't have some sort of conspiracy theory about Matthew being a Roman plant, given that they're so prone to conspiracy theories.
oh my gosh, I hadn't heard that one.
Hmm.
Okay, that's interesting.
I mean, he was collecting those taxes.
Yes, he was. Yeah, he never stopped doing that, right? Just kept doing it.
According to the story, he kind of repented of his bad collecting, but I don't know if we're told he ever really quit his job. I think we're kind of led to hope that he quit his job.
Yeah, maybe they took that out of the text. Maybe that was just taken out conveniently. King James was like, maybe you should take that part out.
Actually, it's funny because people do want to credit the translation to King James, even though he didn't translate anything. But he did have some opinions on what was going to happen, and we'll get to talk about that later.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it. But before we get into the KJV only issue, I call it an issue because it is an issue, and we'll talk about why. I would love for you to just briefly tell people who you are. If people don't know who you are, I mean, what are you even doing? You should know who Justin is. But I just have to say this before you start telling people who you are. One of the funniest YouTube debates that I have seen was this kid that he called in, and he was a college student, and he said, "I just have to let you know my professor is sitting here with me."
That's a great one.
The kid, you talked the kid under the table in like no time at all, like within a couple minutes. So then he passes the phone off to his professor, and he kept asking you what your credentials were. So you told him, which I do want you to mention what your credentials are, because some people are going to be like, well, where did he go to school? It, like that guy was doing to you. And he never admitted where he went to college, where he got his supposed master's, and how he became a professor and what his background was. He just kept gaslighting you and then deflecting the question back to you.
Right.
And I was like, now I'm like really curious. I'm like, did he go to Hiles? Did he go to Pensacola Bible Institute? Because you asked him if he went to PCC, and he said no. He said he didn't go to Bob Jones University. And then you're like, oh no, you went to the Sam Gipp basement Bible Institute. I was like, that is so true. Because I kept saying, I'm like, what? He probably went to a Bible Institute. Maybe he went to a Bible Institute. I thought maybe he went to Ruckman's.
I
He
wouldn't
never
put it by
said.
him. He probably went to Kent Hovind's Patriot University trailer, and started his dissertation with this book.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. Oh, so I just had to say that because I'm like, some of these well, I would say probably a lot of, not just some, a big portion of these professors claim to be professors in
Right.
these colleges, in these Bible colleges, in these institutions that are, funded by the church. Don't have credentials. They
Right.
maybe graduated from a college that isn't accredited and has no real backing for anything. So it's, you have these guys who have formed their opinions, and they're teaching that as truth to these college students, who are then, they're churning out into these missionaries and these evangelists and these pastors and these youth pastors, and then they're teaching the next generation of people, and they're just regurgitating this bullshit that we've been taught for so long. And yeah, that's my 2 cents on that. So, Justin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I mean, Jenny, you make a great point. And so, for example, I went to Bible college at Bethel University. When I was there, it was still called Bethel College in Mishawaka, Indiana, kind of a suburb of South Bend. And then I did seminary at Ashland Seminary and got my master's of divinity there. And both in Bible college and in seminary, I concentrated on the Hebrew Bible. That was way more interesting to me than the New Testament. So while I did learn Greek when I was in seminary, when I was in Bible college, I did Hebrew in Bible college and seminary. So I got kind of an extra dose of Hebrew. That being said, it's important. I want to piggyback on what you said. Education is important in biblical studies. And I'll tell you why. It's not because people think you go to school and they tell you what to believe, they tell you what theology you need to have. Most seminaries, especially good ones that are accredited, don't actually do that. A really good school is going to teach you the history, the culture, the languages, probably cognate languages. They're going to teach you where to find primary sources to do the contextual research. So you're going to be reading ancient Near Eastern literature if you're studying the Old Testament. You're going to be reading Greco-Roman literature if you're reading the New Testament. And so what they want to do is they want to teach you how to think for yourself. They want to teach you how to be a theologian, not what to believe. So
Mhm.
if you go to a school and they said, here's the right way to believe it. You must believe this or you're not a Christian. You didn't go to a good school. The goal of school is not to teach you what to believe, it's to teach you how to do research and to think for yourself. So a lot of these, like Ruckmanites and a lot of these people who went to these unaccredited Bible colleges, typically what they really are is they're training institutions to say, here's the package of what we believe is our version of Christianity that's essential. And then they duplicate it. This student gets this. And then they just repeat. So that's not what real biblical education is about. I understand you might not know that as a young person if you're first getting into exploring possibly going to a Bible college or a seminary. But I would emphasize anyone watching interested in higher education of the Bible, find a school, one that's accredited. It doesn't mean that they're teaching government standards. It means that the government standards applied to the school make it so that you're actually learning something that is useful rather than just being like somebody else's guinea pig where they get to teach you everything they want and then hope that you repeat it later. So like academic standards are like something like this. You can't hire all of your professors from within your institution, meaning you can't graduate somebody and then all of your graduates become professors there because you have no diversity within your academic training. So you can't do that kind of stuff. And so having like actual regional accreditations and things like that just ensures that you're not turning into a diploma mill. It ensures that you're not turning into some sort of a cult focused type of Bible college or seminary. It ensures that you're doing real academics on the subjects that you're teaching rather than just trying to turn out copycats.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's exactly what you described is Bob Jones University and West Coast Baptist College, because that's what they do. They have the graduates then go into a master's program or a PhD, get their PhD, and then they become professors within that same university or within a university or college that's approved within that, that camp, as we
Right.
call it, that, somebody else made the point, like, it's a fraternity. It's really just a group of people that they all kind of promote each other. And that's why I say it's really a cult, because they control the thought of everybody.
Right.
Like what's being taught, what's being said, what's being enforced, even down to the very Bible that they use.
Yeah.
And I know that when you mentioned that you were learning like Greek and Hebrew and things like that, they did teach that at Bob Jones. But I'll tell you, the way that I was raised in my own home, my dad was very much against people learning the Greek and Hebrew, very much against it. And so he would say that the Greek and Hebrew was inferior to the King James Bible. And I would be like, well, how? Because it comes from the Greek and Hebrew. And we can get into this, but then he would always say, like, a lot of people they would say they're correcting the Bible by using the Greek
Mm.
and Hebrew. They're correcting the Bible. And they would also say a lot of the translators of the newer versions are using the Alexandrian text versus the Textus Receptus, which is, a whole nother subject. And
Hmm.
I'm like, what is at the time, like, what is the difference? In the explanation that I was given was the Alexandrian text came out of Egypt, and
Oh
Egypt is a
no.
form of the world. Egypt is an evil place. And I'm like, make it make sense. Like, I don't, and they would say things like you've mentioned on some of your debates too, like they would say the phrase, any other version is a perversion. They
Hmm.
also believe that the KJV 1611, which isn't even the actual version they're reading, it's not the 1611, but they don't know
Right.
that because they're too ignorant. But they would say the KJV 1611 is going to be at the right hand of the Father in heaven, not the original, not the, it's the KJV 1611 is going to be right there on the throne. Like, it's in heaven, and it's the preserved word of God. I mean, these are the things I heard my whole life. I mean, we were so extreme where under our baptistry, I was thinking about this the other day. In the auditorium, we had a big opening for the baptistry right behind like the choir loft. The pulpit was in the front, and then you had the choir loft, and then you had a big opening for the baptistry. And underneath that, for the longest time, they had built this like paper mache, huge, I'm talking like a 20-foot spine of the KJV 1611 Bible that went right underneath the baptistry. against the choir loft. And that was like a decoration for decades in our church. And then my dad, he had some kind of samurai sword, or so I don't even know where the heck he got this thing, but it had like, I swear to God, it's still there, and he's deceased. And the pastor that's there now was a preacher boy in his church, and he left it there. It's mounted onto the front of the pulpit. It's this plaque of this big sword. It's like a samurai sword or something, and it has the handle of it is like a king, like I don't even know, like a brass. It almost looks like a Nebuchadnezzar head. It's weird.
Oh,
And it says like authorized by the king, blah blah blah, like the sword
has
of
to
the
be
Lord.
authorized,
And I'm
not by
like, I'm like,
God, by the king.
yeah. Well, they would always say the KJV is the only Bible that is authorized by the king. That's like their claim to fame. It's like it had like it was like a double entendre, right? They were like it's by King James, but it's really by the King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
Right. Yeah,
Right? It
yeah.
was like this
Uh-huh.
double
Yeah,
meaning.
yeah. I'm sorry, did the Lord of Lords authorize any English translations prior to that? I don't know. It seems weird that he would randomly select that one English translation.
Apparently.
Mine, I got the 1611 here, and mine doesn't give me the authorized, although most of the newer ones do. But mine does explicitly state without the Apocrypha, which is that's
Yes.
something they're standing on business. They do not want that stinking apocrypha in their Bible. But we're not going to get to talk about the apocrypha much today because I think we've got other stuff we have to cover. But I do have an 1823 right here.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Apocrypha because the original translation of the KJV 1611 included the Apocrypha and they later removed it.
Yeah, they did. So I've got it. This one should be, yeah, this is 1823. This is a Collins stereotype King James Bible, and it says the Old and New Testament together with the Apocrypha. In 1823, they were still publishing these with the Apocrypha. They didn't remove them really until late in the 19th century, and then definitely in the 20th century. But so the idea that the Apocrypha shouldn't be in the Bible, especially with these King James purists, it's a very recent thing. This is not something that is like a traditional King James invention. King James, almost all of three-quarters of its history or more included the Apocrypha.
Mm-hmm.
So it's weird that the King James only purists refused to buy a King James Bible with the Apocrypha. It's wild.
Right. So when did they remove that? Do you know what year it was or roundabout?
It was one of those things where it was like the publishers started to realize that it was cheaper to print the Bibles without it. A lot of the people reading the King James were asking to get Bibles without it anyways. And so publishers just started deciding themselves and kind of at will to stop publishing it with the Apocrypha because they're like, we can save money, we can sell the Bible for the same price and have less printing. And so they just started leaving it out. And not only did nobody complain, that became the new sacred text. But
Yeah, you know what's
yeah.
interesting is another thing that I remember hearing as we're having this discussion was the King James version is the only version that doesn't have a copyright.
Mm.
So it can be printed freely without there's no copyright attached to it.
Yeah, that may be true, but only because it's like in the open domain because it's so old. I mean, the same would be true of any other Bible that's old. So I
Mm-hmm.
think open domain is after 75 years. Is that the how it is right now? So
I'm not sure. I'm not sure,
the,
but that was just one of the things they always said. One of the many reasons that they would give to proof, in their mind that the King James was the one and only Bible.
I think there are multiple copyrights on the King James Bible, and the last one. So if you get one looks like this, here's a traditional King James Family Bible.
I
Nine
got one of
times
those on my wedding day, Justin. It looked just like that.
the bigger the better. The bigger your King James is, the more authoritative it is. So Most King James Bible, which reads identical to mine, are going to be a 1769 copyright. I'm pretty sure 1769 was the last copyright that they had, and then after that, I don't believe there was another copyright, or at least not one that I can recall. But prior to that, there was copyright, and so it's they make it sound like, well, this Bible's special because like it was made and then like freely distributed and no copyright. That's not really the way it worked. There's no
Mhm.
copyright now because it's expired.
Yeah. Okay, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, I would like to talk about just briefly, like, who was King James? Or
Mine
what do
is
we?
copyrighted.
It is copyrighted. Okay, there you have it,
This,
guys.
this particular version of the Bible is copyrighted by Christian Arts Publishers in 2012.
There you go, guys. And this episode is airing in 2025. So, but I would love for people to understand a little bit of history on who King James was, because I think that, especially the cult I was raised in the IFB, and how dogmatic they were about the King James Bible, I think they would be kind of shocked to learn some things about who he actually was. And I don't know how far you want to get into this, but there's certain aspects that I know that they do not, they would not be okay with.
Like King James is often kind of classified as being a bit of a tyrant,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of like King James lore. There's lore that he had child lovers based on some of the notes that we have. The reality is he may or may not have had child lovers, but there was at least one young man that he referred to as his child lover, although child is such a semantic range, it's hard to know what his age was.
Mm-hmm.
So like he's one of those guys that seems problematic. You wouldn't expect him to want to put out a Bible translation. Like what would a guy who's really obsessed with demonology and the
Yes.
occult
Mm-hmm.
and like wrote his own book on it, and a guy who's also secretly or not so secretly sleeping around with young men. What would he do? What would he have to do with the Bible translation? And the reality is the Bible translation for him was a utilitarian effort. He was attempting to get a Bible translation to be a replacement for the bishop's Bible. And
Mm-hmm.
we'll talk about that when we kind of get into a little bit of our presentation. But the for lack of better words, a lot of these independent Christian zones, Protestant Christian zones, wanted to establish a text that was different from the Latin text, which was the ecclesiastical text of the Catholic Church. So when they broke off, they're like, we need a text. Luther had a text. We need a text. Geneva had a text. That's going to become important soon. And so they had the bishop's Bible for a while prior to King James, and he wanted an update to the bishop's Bible that would be specific to his kingdom. That would be their official text. And then
Mm-hmm.
if they have an official text, that means he has a little bit of control over what's in the text. So for him, it was a matter of like unifying the kingdom under a specific text and also, side note, getting rid of maybe some problematic stuff in some of the other Bibles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you think that it was also like maybe a political move as well, where how like when a president is going out, it's like their lame duck presidency, and they're going out and they want to have something to be remembered by. Maybe they have some scandals along the way, or they have some
Mhm.
stuff that people aren't happy with, and they want to go out with a bang. Like, oh, I remember this president brought this to the American people, or you know what I'm saying? Like, pass this law or something like that. Do you think that maybe that was he was hoping that would sort of erase some of the rumors or some of the things that people were talking about, and give him a little bit of that, like, notoriety? Oh, hey, this is the King James. It was named after him
Mhm.
too.
So this is actually a really good question because what we find with a lot of authoritarian leaders is they will embark on particular projects or sometimes they'll engage in mass philanthropy in order to kind of whitewash their
Mm-hmm.
image. And it certainly could be the case that part of the endeavor with the Bible was in order to whitewash his image because he was
Mhm.
known to fight with Parliament. He was known because they wanted to resist his totalitarian type of tactics. So certainly this could be a means to garner popular support among the people while
Mhm.
getting to whitewash his image as possibly, well, being a man prone to debauchery.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's where my mind goes because, even in the current like political climate we're in, I'm like, some things really never change, right? So I just think, what was the motivation? What was the agenda behind this that he had? Because I don't think he was doing it to be like a good person or used of God, as a lot of people think. He's not like, God, how can you use me?
I don't think he was on his knees praying to the Lord, what could I do, Lord, to serve the kingdom today when he came up
Yeah.
with the King James. There certainly was a political motive to it. And me personally, and we talked about this briefly, I think one of the biggest motives was he wanted to solidify his power. And one of the biggest threats to his power was the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was sweeping across Europe as one of the favorites of the English translations, and it said some things that were not so favorable of the king. There
Hmm.
was mentions in there about kings being tyrants. There were mentions in there that were positive towards disobedience to the king. In fact, in Exodus, it says in one note, it says, the disobedience herein was lawful, referring to the
Hmm.
disobedience to Pharaoh, which is that's not what you want to hear if you're King James, that you could disobey the king and it would be lawful. So there's a passage in First Samuel that talks about kings' rights over the children of the inhabitants. And it says, and he said that there should be the manner of the king, that he shall reign over you, and he will take your sons and appoint him to his chariots. Meaning, like, he can take your sons. This is the right of the king. And this is part of the warning against kings in the book of Samuel. And the footnote on the side of the Geneva Bible says, not ye kings have this auto right by their office, meaning this is not a right that kings
Hmm.
have. And so in the Geneva Bible, we find a lot of side notes in the margin. In fact, you'll be able to see even from my print, the margins are full of footnotes. And so when King James had his Bible done, he targeted the footnotes first. You'll notice there are no footnotes in the King James Bible except for ones that are there to clarify the uncertain meaning of some of the Hebrew words. And we'll see that in the translator notes. There's notes given to the translators to follow as guidelines. And one of those is to not have any marginal notes except for what was necessary for understanding some of the uncertain Greek and Hebrew words, because the marginal notes were the one of the biggest problems in the Geneva Bible because there were so many marginal notes that were negative towards the king.
Okay, so that's interesting. Do you think that they were kind of doing that in order for people to not dive into the Greek and Hebrew texts? Like they were putting these notes, like, oh, so you understand what this means better. We'll put these notes in the bottom. But it's kind of like encouraging people to not study the Greek and Hebrew on their own.
My understanding, so the Geneva Bible was popularized in the Reformed movement, mostly in Geneva, where it started under Calvin. And so my understanding is that they did want an educated populace, but they understood that most of them couldn't read. And the ones that could read weren't going to learn a whole new language. They're going to read it in the vulgar tongue. So I think they viewed the footnotes as being helpful, but also John Calvin, he was just as strict sometimes about theology as was King James or anyone else. For example, there was an opponent, a famous opponent of his, that they disagreed so vehemently that he had him killed. So it seems to be that the goal of formulating what we have in the Geneva Bible was to help the population, What we found in the King James Bible was to control the population.
Interesting. So, Justin, you have prepared quite a presentation for our viewers and listeners today. And if you are listening to this, he's going to go through this presentation with as much description as he can for your ears and not your eyes. But for those who are tuning in on YouTube, you can see the presentation in real time during this podcast episode. And I say we get into it. I'm excited to dive into all the details, and hopefully, if you're listening to this, it will answer any questions y'all might have about, why the King James version does have flaws. And I can't believe I just said that, because that's like sacrilege in the way I was raised. But yeah, I mean, this is going to be a very educational episode for anyone listening or viewing. So I'm excited to get into that.
So I wasn't sure how many problems to raise. So I tried to get, because there's so many. I actually have a spreadsheet with all my translational issues with the King James. But so I kind of tried to grab what I would consider like a smattering of
Okay.
different types of problems, if that makes sense. Like rather
Yes.
than just doing, here's a translation problem and here's all the different variants of it. I tried to be diversified. You'll see what I mean when we get into it.
Okay.
So, kind of an overview of some of the problems I wanted to cover is number one, the most of the project was copied from the Bishop's Bible. We kind of touched on that a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
I've got on one of the slides some of the translator instructions that'll illustrate what I'm talking about. And then the second issue are manuscript errors. So the manuscripts sometimes just weren't good. We've got translation errors, meaning the translators weren't good. And then we have quite a few instances of editorializing. And this is probably my biggest complaint. I could have pulled out a lot of passages on this, but once I point it out, I think readers will start noticing it as they're going through the King James themselves. So editorializing is like when you're translating something in an effort to have a theology behind it come to the forefront. So, for example, we might say in common vernacular, we might say something like, have a nice day. But if you're Christian, you might say, have a blessed day, because you're like, we need you to know that I'm a Christian. And so
Right.
there's some words and tones and translation decisions in the King James that are like, we're only using these words because we need to convey a particular theological meaning with them, not
Okay.
because they're the best translation. Another problem that we're going to cover today is point number 5, and this is important, which is old cultural or linguistic data. So one of the issues we have is the information that we had available in 1611 is different than the information we had available today. So as it turns out, we've discovered thousands of manuscripts, thousands of clay tablets from ancient Near East and from the Mediterranean, and we just know more about the language and culture today than what we knew back then. And then we'll get some examples of that. Issue number 6 are outdated phrases, meaning, hey, our English language has changed, and here's why it matters. And then 7 will be a short one, but outdated references. Like there are things we can say today that we don't say back then. Like no one talks about a fortnight. Like some people know a
Except
fortnight
for
is
Taylor Swift. She's
Fortnite is
bringing
not
that
a
back,
video game.
Justin. There is a
And
song,
then
guys. She's bringing it back. I'm just saying.
T Swift is a legend. I hope she outlives King James' legendary figure. We'll see.
Same.
And I think the last issue is the shifting of word meanings, because just because there's a word on a page that you recognize doesn't mean you know how it's being used. And we're going to give some examples of that. And so some of the imperfections were actually known by the translators. If you get a full King James Bible, and I encourage somebody, don't get a scaled back one like this. Get one, this one only has a partial introductory. They sell King James Bibles with a full preface from the translators, from the translating committee. That preface is amazing. It's long, but it's worth reading. I pulled out 2 quotes from the preface to help illustrate that even the translators did not believe this was a perfect translation. So it says in our first quote that they're actually comparing in the first quote, they're comparing King James to the translation itself. And trust me, they're not saying King James is perfect. So it says, a man, King James, may be counted as virtuous man, though he have many slips in his life, else there were none virtuous, for in many things we offend all. Also, a comely man. That was a comely man, obviously, was added for King James's own benefit.
Of course, yeah.
And lovely.
Also, he had a lot of issues, but he was comely.
He was comely and lovely. But it says, though he have some warts upon his hand, yea, not only freckles upon his face, but all scars. No cause, therefore, why the word translated should be denied to the word or forbidden to be current, notwithstanding that same imperfections and blemishes may be noted in the setting forth of it. So he's saying just like the king is lovely and comely, but has these imperfections and blemishes, so true, this translation is having some imperfections and blemishes. So the translators did not expect this to be a perfect endeavor, and that's quite clear if you continue to read. And one of the other things I wanted to point out is, first of all, the translators who embarked on the King James Bible, they were good. A lot of them were for Oxford, Cambridge. They weren't noobs. These are really trained individuals. So I'm not saying that they were bad translators. I'm saying that we just have better stuff now for reasons we'll get into. So they freely admitted in the preface that there are words that they don't always know. It says there may be words in the scriptures which be never found there but once, meaning, hey, sometimes there's words, there's only one of them in the Hebrew Bible. We don't really know what it's supposed to mean. Our extra biblical sources don't always know what it means. It says, having neither brother nor neighbor, as the Hebrews speak, so that we cannot be holpen to conference of places. Again, there may be rare names of certain birds, beasts, and precious stones, etc., concerning which the Hebrews themselves are so divided among themselves for judgment that they may seem to have defined this or that rather because they would say something, because they were sure that which they said. As Jerome somewhere said of the Septuagint, so the idea is like, listen, there are some words in the Hebrew that we're unclear of, and even the native Hebrew speakers don't know. And so we'll find in the King James, those are where we find marginal notes. You'll find marginal notes in your King James Bible that typically are only referencing the translation difficulties because they knew that sometimes it's not perfect. It's going to need revision. Or sometimes we couldn't adequately explain it in the verse because the Hebrew carried additional meaning that our English equivalent doesn't have. So here's what some of the instructions are to the translators, though. So the translators, I think, were honest, good people. Here's some of the instructions, however, given to them. So the first instruction in the list of instructions, I don't have numbers, but this actually is the first one in the list that they give, says the ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the bishop's Bible, to be followed and as little altered as the original will permit. So the goal is to produce a new ecclesiastical Bible as close to the bishop Bible as possible because we don't want to shock readers by having a drastically different Bible that they're not used to. We want to keep it as close as possible to the original that they're used to. If the original manuscripts dictate that there needs to be a change, then it's okay. The next major translation issue that he points out, which isn't really related to translation, but only adjacent to it, says no marginal notes at all to be affixed, but only for the explanation of the Hebrew or Greek words, which cannot, without some circumlocution, so briefly and fitly be expressed in the text. And this sounds innocent enough, but the reality is he wanted no marginal notes because he doesn't want people to express their theological opinions, even if it addresses the king. And then the next one is when any place of special obscurity is doubted, of letters to be directed by authority to send to any learned man in the land for his judgment of such a place. So this is kind of an awkward wording, but what he's saying is if we get to a translation and we don't know what it means, send it to somebody who might be an expert in this field. So there's an
Wow.
admission right up front that, hey, there might be some stuff that our translators don't know that they're going to have to farm out and find an expert for, just like Jerome did. They talk swimmingly about Jerome in the preface and how Jerome, when he first started to embark on correcting the old Latin manuscripts to make the Vulgate, he didn't even know Hebrew. He had to go to the Hebrews and learn it. And they loved that he had such the initiative to go find experts. And so they were of the same opinion. If we don't know it, we're going to try to find somebody who does. But they're freely admitting there are some things they don't know. And then the last one that I pulled out from the translator notes, this is these translations to be used when they agree better with the text than the bishop's Bible. So they point out, listen, if the Greek and Hebrew dictates that it should be changed, the bishop's Bible isn't good. They got it wrong. Try to follow one of these other English translations rather than making up your own English translation. And the ones that they point to is Tyndale's, Coverdale's, Matthew's, White Church's, and then even the Geneva Bible. So there was this idea of like, don't fully invent your whole new Bible. Try to keep
Mhm.
it recognizable. These people out here reading the New King James or the King James, they've already got familiar with these other English Bibles. So if one of the other English Bibles got it better, just use that phrasing. It'll be easier for the reader. So anyone thinking that the King James translators came to the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic texts and just sat down with them and did the best translation they could, that's not really how it went. They
Mhm.
more or less did a Bible revision. It's completely different than doing a whole new translation. So that's important to recognize that like 80% of the King James Bible is copied mostly from the Geneva Bible or the Bishop's Bible or from one of the other English Bibles that preceded it, which is
Mhm.
why if you compare it to the Bishop's Bible, you're not going to find a lot of differences.
Yeah, which is a very interesting point. And also, I always wonder too, it's like the first page or so of my King James Bible had the note that says that it was translated from the original tongue.
Yes,
It's like, okay, translated from the original tongue, but we can't study the Greek and the Hebrew. Like that doesn't it doesn't make any sense. Like make it make sense, Justin.
100%. It'll say newly translated out of the original tongues. And
Mm-hmm.
it says, and with former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special commandment. And then it says, appointed to be read in the churches. So it's pretty clear that the people who made the King James understood that the authority of this English text comes from the fact that it was translated from the original Greek and Hebrew. And they point that out in the preface. If you get a full preface in your King James, the translators point out that the thing that makes the English Bibles special compared to what the Catholics were doing is the Catholics were translating from the Latin manuscript into some English translation sometimes. And the Latin manuscript was actually just a translation of the Greek Septuagint,
Mm-hmm.
which means the Old Testament wasn't being translated out of the original tongue. It was being translated out of a translation. So the translators of the King James pointed out, said, hey, we should be making our translation out of the original documents. And they would have been thrilled to live in our day and have as many documents as we have today to work with, which they didn't have back then. And in fact, before we do our next slide, I want to show you what they're working with. So, modern Bible readers, you mentioned the Alexandrian texts. And so I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. Modern Bible readers think, or KJV Bible readers think that there's like two textual streams. You got the evil
Yeah.
one or the good one.
Yeah. Yeah. The Textus Receptus or the Alexandrian text. And the Alexandrian
Sure.
supposedly it came out of Egypt, and Egypt is the picture of the world, and that's why it's evil. That's what I was told.
Yeah.
This is what I was taught.
It's unfortunate that they believe such silly things, but so This is a critical edition of the New Testament Greek. And what you'll find in a critical edition of the New Testament Greek is you'll find an apparatus at the bottom of every page. That's this large block of text. And what it does is it gives you a reading of the text in Greek, and then below it'll have very abbreviated footnotes that tell you what the variant readings are in all the other manuscripts. So, for example, they're not taking just like the Alexandrian text type and saying, oh, we're going to do this now. What they're doing is they're taking the TR, they're taking Byzantine, Alexandrian, they're taking quotes from the early church fathers, they're taking ecclesiastical books that were used in church services. They're taking books that were made for prayers and hymnals that are quoting Bible passages. They're even pulling from pottery shards that were collected from ancient archaeological digs. And they're using all of those sources to put together what they think the original probably said. And then they tell you all the variants. Well, here's the manuscripts that differ. And what you won't find in here is a variant that just says, well, the Alexandrian text types all say this, because the Alexandrian text type is not a manuscript. They're not comparing a body of family manuscripts to the TR when they're making these critical editions. They're saying, here's all the manuscripts we have. Using all the manuscripts we have, what's the best we can determine for the text? And then for the Old Testament, it's the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. And the newest one, I think, is actually going to be more in English rather than like a Latin or a German. That's another story, but they've got the same thing. In the Hebrew text, you'll find at the bottom of every page apparatus showing where it differs in the Hebrew manuscripts. In the 1611 era, they didn't have a lot of manuscripts to work from. In fact, some of them were even incomplete. For example, Revelation. The book of Revelation in Greek was not complete. So the critical edition that they had to work from actually backwards translated the Latin into Greek so that they would have a Greek text to work from because they
Mhm.
didn't have a complete set of Greek manuscripts for it. So we have discovered many, many manuscripts since then that fill in those blanks. There's no reason that we would want to depend on an old critical edition that is no longer relevant. And for the Old Testament, they mostly just used the Masoretic text, which at their time was a combination of the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. And so in my presentation, I've got some images of problems that are in the Aleppo Codex that find their way into the King James Bible.
Hmm.
So this is an interesting problem from Psalm 145. If you go to Psalm 145, you'll find an acrostic. And it's a really neat acrostic. And the problem though, in fact, I'm curious in one of my modern King James Bibles if they have it laid out by number, because some of the modern Bibles have started to do that. They've laid it out by, I'm sorry, by letter, so
You
that,
said Psalm 145?
yeah.
Okay. I'm looking it up as well as you talk about it.
Let's see. I think this Bible might do it. Although a lot of King James Bibles don't do it, this one might do it. This one didn't do it. Oh, that's so sad. Okay.
I don't see an acrostic in mine either, but I want to hear about this though.
They do have it for Psalm 119 at least. In Psalm
Oh.
119, they show that it's laid out in the acrostic format. So the way the acrostic format works is like the beginning of a line would be like starting with an A. The beginning of the next line would start with a B. The beginning of the next line would start with a C. That's a typical acrostic. Well, what we find in the King James 145 is that the line that would be starting with the Hebrew letter Nun was just missing. And the reason why it's missing in the King James Bible is in fact because it's not in the Masoretic texts. It didn't make it in. Somebody had a copying whoopsie, and that line just got left out. So in the Aleppo Codex and in the Leningrad Codex, they had no access to it, so it didn't make it into the King James Bible. But when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we discovered 11Q5. In 11Q5, we actually find the Nun that gets retained. The Nun should go right here in the verse. unfortunately, it's not there. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they happen to retain it. The noon line starts right there. That's noon. So we actually do get mem and then noon and then samic. And so all modern Bible translations include it. You'll find in your modern Bible translation, you'll find an additional verse in Psalm 145 that gives you the missing line from the noon. And so like let's see, I've got the Net Bible with full notes, and I assume the Net Bible not only will have this new verse in it, they're going to have a footnote on why this verse is here, and it's not in the King James Bible, in fact. The Net Bible is pretty good about pointing some of that stuff out so that when people of the King James Bible come along, they're not upset by it. It's funny, I wrote an article on this like 8 years ago, and actually 9 years ago now, and I include all the quotations from the Hebrew text, and I didn't put the verse number in there either. There's no verse numbers in the Hebrew text. So like I didn't think about it. And you'll find some King James apologetics on the internet crying that they've added a verse in there. The newest iteration of the NRSV does have it, just not the older iteration of it. I was under the impression that most of the new translations had it included now. Not all of them do, apparently. But in the NRSV updated edition, you should find in verse 13 and 14, there's an additional verse added. It should read, "Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures throughout all generations." And then 14 comes next. But in between that should be a line that says, "The Lord is faithful in all of his words and gracious in all of his deeds." That should be the addition to the text that the King James Bible leads out because they're just missing that line. I would imagine that here in the coming years, almost all of the Bible translations are going to follow suit with the NRSV updated edition and start including that missing passage. I thought that the NIV already did, and they did. I looked at the NIV just now. They've got it included now. The NRSV updated edition has it included as well. And then let's check out the NAB. Yeah, NAB already didn't have it in there, which is really interesting. So some of the newer translations are adding it in, and some of them haven't added it in yet. But it's widely known in textual criticism that this is a common problem, that the manuscripts that were being used for a long time as authoritative are just missing that part of the acrostic. And so they're slowly adding that one in there. But you'll find it in all the King James Bible, you'll find that missing.
It's interesting that you're saying the newer translations would have that in there versus the older ones have taken it out. I find that very interesting because the people who subscribe to the King James only, stance, they always say that nothing was taken out and nothing was added to. It's not a watered down version, they would say. Um, so this is a very interesting thing that you just brought up. And also to piggyback off of that thought, you would think that people would be even more open to a newer translation, even like a very much more modernized translation, given the ability that we have and the discoveries that have been made since then, and also the AI that we could just probably put in all these manuscripts and have it translated into something much more updated where everything is contained together. I have often wondered why the book of Enoch wasn't included in the
Mm.
Bible. And it's like, well, why isn't that in there? But then we're not, it's got so many things that kind of connect the dots with the book of Revelation and other books of the Bible that leave you kind of hanging like, what the heck does this mean? And people that do read the book of Enoch are like, oh, this will actually answer a lot of the questions. Well, why was that taken out? Who made that choice? My own thoughts that I've had over the years that just never made sense to me, and no one was ever able to answer them.
Well, that's a fair point. So Jude 114 quotes from Enoch, actually.
Right.
And you're familiar with that. And listen to what he says. He says, Enoch, the seventh in descent beginning with Adam, even prophesied of them, saying, Look, the Lord is coming with thousands and thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, so on and so forth. So he's referencing the book of Enoch as being prophecy, which is actually really important that the Bible thinks that Enoch is prophetic. And that quote comes from First Enoch 1:9, where it says, Behold, he comes with tens of thousands of his holy ones to pass judgment on all. So listen, if Jude, the brother of Jesus, thinks that Enoch is prophetic and authoritative, then it's weird that Christians didn't include it in the canon, or at least they might have removed it from possibly being part of the canon at some point, although it's part of the Ethiopic canon. And even as late as Tertullian, Tertullian wrote a lengthy letter defending the Book of Enoch, saying that it should be authoritative. So there certainly was a fight at some point in the early church about which books should be included and which ones shouldn't be included, and Enoch just didn't make the cut. But most of the Apocrypha, believe it or not, were included. I have a collection of the first 400 years of the church where I documented every single church father quote about the Apocrypha or one of the Apocryphal books, or when they quoted from the Apocrypha, how they used it. Hundreds of quotations. And every time they say that it's scriptural, it's prophetic, it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, it's God's word. And so it's baffling to me that Protestants today are like, well, the early church didn't think it was authoritative. They certainly did if you read their writings, but that's why they don't know that the Apocrypha should be in their Bible, because they were so against church history. They hated the Catholics so much that they refused to learn the actual history of their Bible. Now they're all confused, thinking that it was never authoritative when it actually was the entire time.
And interestingly enough, the Apocrypha was included in the original translation of the King James Bible. It was later removed, I think you said in the 1769 or something, wasn't it?
Even later than that, it was removed in the late 19th century. So even in the early 1800s, you'll find a lot of them, almost all of them, still retained it. Now that we got 145 out of the way, we finally discovered where the issue lied in verse 13, the end of 13, beginning of 14, or right before the beginning of 14. Let's move on to another one. Now that we got 145 out of the way, we finally discovered where the issue lied in verse 13, the end of 13, beginning of 14, or right before the beginning of 14. Let's move on to another one. This is a really interesting manuscript error, and this is a fun one because this shows that the adage of like, well, the manuscripts that we received in 1611 were carefully documented, and like if there was one mistake in it, they would like burn it, that kind of nonsense. Yeah, none of that's true. That's not how the manuscripts were passed down. In fact, here's a copy of a manuscript that, in fact, this is the Aleppo manuscript, where you can see somebody wrote down a line and then had to scratch it out and write something in over top of it, and it's barely legible because they were editing and fussing around with manuscripts all the time, and sometimes I would say quite carelessly. So in the Aleppo Codex, we find like this really interesting, we call it error, maybe a mistake is better, but it's in Psalm 96:13. There's a line that gets changed. So the end of this line is Lifnei Yahweh Kiba Kiba, which means before the Lord, or sometimes in the presence of the Lord, for he's coming, he's coming. For he's coming, for he's coming. So it's just like a really interesting phrase because you're like, why do we have Kiba Kiba? Why do we duplicate that? Well, it turns out that the translators or the keepers of the text didn't know either, and so we find that they're altering the text to something else. In fact, they altered it to Lifnei Yahweh Kiba Kiba, and then here's a part that was added on the end because they thought it was missing. This is the part that they wrote over this mysterious crossed out part. So we see that we have a manuscript that read weird at the beginning. They suspected something was wrong with it. They scratched it out, tried to amend it, and it still doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So it'd be, the presence of the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth, is what it would read, right? This
Mhm.
phrase "to judge the earth" is what they wrote in. So we just like, if you're working on the Bible, you just kind of have to assume that what they chicken scratched over top of it was right. But I think the correct reading of it is what we find in Psalm 89:9. The identical quote that we find in Psalm 96:13 shows up in Psalm 89:9, and it's actually coherent. So there are two versions of this quotation, and the one in Psalm 96:13 seems to be wrong. That makes it into the Masoretic text. It makes it into the King James Bible, and I think the correct reading, and a lot of people agree, is actually Psalm 98, verse 9, where it says, Lifnei Yahweh Kiba and Lishpat Ha'eret. So it'd be in the presence of the Lord, for is coming to judge the earth, which is what you would expect. You don't need the repetition of, right? But the
Mhm.
reality is, like, when you have a manuscript and it's part of a sacred body of literature, sometimes people try to make corrections because they're like, oh no, we have to correct it. There's a mistake. But then in correcting it, they make a mistake themselves because they don't know, right? And so it
Mhm.
shows that like the transmission of this literature isn't as easy as what people think it is. Scribes all throughout history have been scratching and changing on these manuscripts in order to get them to read what they think it should have read. This is not being guided by the Holy Spirit, or else all the manuscripts would agree.
Yeah, and they've legit said that they're just as inspired by the Holy Spirit as the original writers of the Bible. Like, I've heard it
Right.
all. It's like, okay.
Or what they'll say is, well, the errors were inspired as well. Okay, yeah, you got me. God, not the author of confusion, but he did inspire errors in his book on purpose. Okay.
Hey, you know what? All I gotta say is if my family hadn't already disowned me for having a podcast exposing this stuff, then after they hear this episode, they'll have fully disowned me.
And you know what? This last manuscript error, they're really not going to like. So it's been known for a while in scholarly circles that the old form of Deuteronomy 32:8 was deficient. So we learned it was deficient when we finally got the Dead Sea Scrolls. We knew for sure it was deficient. We had inklings that it was deficient before because in the early Greek translations of it, it differed from the Masoretic text. But Deuteronomy 32:8 in the KJV reads, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people of Israel according to the number of the children of Israel, or literally in the text, it would be the number of the sons of Israel. But this is a weird phrase. What does it mean that they numbered humanity, this Adam, according to the number of the children of Israel? What a weird. And so they thought for a long time this might be a change in the text. They might have changed something in here because they didn't like it or they didn't understand it. And what we find in the Greek Septuagint, that's what the LXX stands for. It actually reads according to the angels of God. This is angelotheu, meaning the angels of God. It's a genitive form. So the sons of God, when you find in the Greek Septuagint where it says like the angels of God, often that means the underlying text used to say the sons of God. And so they theorized for a long time, hey, maybe the original Hebrew of Deuteronomy 32:8 actually said the sons of God rather than the sons of Israel. And so when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we discovered that. So we find in the Aleppo Codex, which is what we have in the King James, it just says B'nai Yisrael, which means the sons of Israel. But in Qumran 4Q Deuteronomy, the J edition, it says sons of God, B'nai Elohim. And we find that right here on the text. Elohim slightly cut off, but we have almost all of it in there. So we basically have the entire thing minus the part of the Mem Sofit. And we've got B'nai fully intact here. So we know now that the older pre-Masoretic tradition said sons of God. And that's a really big change to think that The people of the earth were numbered according to the children of Israel versus the children of God, which is a whole ancient Near Eastern mythology, Canaanite mythology, about how the nations were divided into 70 different nations according to the 70 sons of El. And it even makes it into some of the extra biblical, well, I would consider them biblical, what Protestants consider extra biblical, like in Sirach, verse 17:17, it talks about how the people are divided according to the same schema. There was this idea in the ancient world where there were 70 like minor gods underneath the main god, right? And it wasn't until much later into the period of monotheism that they were like, no, 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 we can't have multiple gods. We can't have sons of God, like in the Ugaritic pantheon, like in Canaanite pantheon. There's only one God, so they had to change it to angel or to messenger or to sons of Israel. And so this was one where we encapsulated the problem very clearly, and we demonstrated that the tradition handed down to us just wasn't preserved very well. And that's okay. That's not the fault of the King James translators. They didn't know any better. They didn't
Mhm.
have the manuscripts that we have today. We just have more manuscripts that are older that preserve an older, less edited tradition.
Mhm. I've always wondered about that phrase, the sons of God. When I was studying the Bible, like inside and out, when I was in Bible college and stuff, I would come across that phrase, sons of God. And then I'm like, is this contradicting? Because certain times in the Bible, they're good, and certain times in the Bible, sons of God is a bad, And it's like, well, are these the same people we're talking about? Who are we talking about here? It's like,
Right. So the ancient Canaanite mythology was that the supreme god El, who gets abstracted with the word Elohim, we don't have to talk about Hebrew abstractions, that god had 70 sons with Asherah, or in Ugaritic, Atarot. So they had 70 sons and a daughter named Anath, and the 70 sons were put in charge of all the nations, one to each nation, and they were expected to, I don't know, manage the nations. And that's why we have Psalms like Psalm 82 that still enshrines this old concept. In fact, if you go to Psalm 82, in almost every Bible translation out there, you're going to read something that like, you probably didn't hear about in church, but it says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? So he's saying, listen, your job was to manage all these nations, all you little gods that are sons of El. Your goal was to manage these nations, and you screwed the pooch. So at the end of the psalm, he says, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. So he's saying, listen, even though you're gods, you're going to die just like the mortals die because I've had it up to here with you. I'm done. So this is echoed in Deuteronomy 32:8, this idea that God had like lesser status children that were in charge of a bunch of stuff down here.
hmm,
It's pretty wild.
it is wild.
So, speaking of Deuteronomy, let's get into what I'm going to call translator goofs. Because as much as I respect the King James translators, sometimes they goofed. It happens. We all do. If I put together a translation, I know it would goof even more than the King James translators. So I'm not saying that I'm smarter than them or better educated than them, because I'm not better educated than them. But you don't have to know everything to spot a mistake. And all the mistakes that I'm going to point out have been pointed out by people with multiple PhDs. I just happen to agree with them. I'm not smarter than the people from Cambridge who did the KJV. So Deuteronomy 8:9 has a really interesting phrase, and some people are going to notice the problem almost immediately when we read it. It says, "A land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, and thou shalt not lack in anything in it. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass." Anyone who's done a little bit of like metallurgy or blacksmithing, or is a fan of metals is going to know that this is a weird phrase because you can't dig brass. This is just a mistake that somebody made. Brass is an alloy that is mined from the hills. It's a copper and zinc mixture, and sometimes there's other additives. And brass itself, the idea that you could mix these alloys together and come up with brass, wasn't even in existence until the year 500 BCE. So even if you thought that the King James translators understood the ancient people of understanding that brass needed to be mixed at some point, it would be irrelevant. We have no evidence whatsoever from the ancient world that brass was even being used at all until 500 years BCE, which means this would have been theoretically 1,000 years after Moses. There's no way Moses was instructing his people on the wealth of the land to include the ability to get brass. They didn't know brass existed yet, and you can't dig for it. It was just a goof. All the new translations fixed this. Even you'll find in some of the newer, like the new King James version, you'll find some of these blunders fixed. And so I think that's an easy one, and you don't have to know Greek or Hebrew to see the problem.
You
It's
know what's
purely
kind of funny is the version that I'm reading. Well, I'm reading the King James version, but the specific study Bible that I have says a footnote that says the correct word is brass, not copper. Although you will find copper or bronze in all the Laodicean apostate corruptions published since 1880. Let's see.
apostate corruption.
That's what it says in the footnotes, okay? The NIV, thinking that nobody could have known about, quote, steel back in those days, has given you a, quote, bow of bronze, 2 Samuel 22:35.
Oh
This
no.
is legit what it says in the footnotes, Justin. Listen to this. Are you ready? The silly asses pervert these scriptures because you could not actually, quote, dig brass out of the ground. They never looked at the figurative statement in the same verse. The same verse said, quote, stones are iron. It obviously was figurative.
Oh boy.
That's
So
what the footnote says in
oh,
my.
the problem with the footnote is that it seems to be implying that brass is a combination of iron and copper, but it's not. I don't know what they're thinking. Also, I don't know if you know this, but in fact, in Moses' time, nobody had technology for smelting iron. It didn't exist yet. So what they could do, like cold forging, where you could take iron and you could beat it into a shape. You could heat it up and you could beat it into a shape, but you couldn't smelt it. You couldn't melt it down and mix it with another alloy. That wasn't something they had technology for.
Mhm.
So the reality is, even if they thought that iron and copper was what you used to make brass, they didn't have the technology to do it back in Moses' day, which means Deuteronomy 8:9 is an absolutely meaningless phrase to the audience. They wouldn't even know what brass was.
Also, I just would like to note that the footnote said silly asses.
I know that it's great that they
What's funny
oh
is
no.
this particular Bible, the person that did these footnotes, he was very much about the Bible being literal and everything needs to be taken literally. So I find this funny.
It's just one of those things where like if you're reading an apologetic Bible, and I'm not sure which one you've got there, I'd be interested. Maybe I need to get one myself. If you're reading the apologetic Bible, you'll find that within the apology for the mistake, they make new mistakes.
Okay, also, I might as well just tell you the Bible now because it is.
Mhm.
This was my little surprise that I had. All right, let's see if I can put this right up to the screen there for you. Can you see the? This is
Oh
a
yeah,
this is
the Ruckman.
a Ruckman study Bible. This is a
Oh
Ruckman reference
man,
Bible. So if you know, you know.
listen, I'm looking at the Ruckman reference Bible.
That's what I
Th-
have.
This is not a cheap Bible.
It is
This
not
this
a cheap Bible.
this guy's making some bank on this Bible.
Well, his family is now because he is no longer with us.
True. So the guy who exclaims publicly that the King James Bible is super special because it's copyrighted and they're not out to make money also sells a $200 study Bible that is more expensive than even the study Bibles in leather on the market done by teams of PhD holding scholars. So
Yeah.
he values his opinion more than like the 70 plus scholars that did the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible. That's some impressive double talk.
Well, he thought he was something and more. Yeah.
Glad you got out of that cult.
Yeah, right. I know. But this is the study Bible that they use at his Bible Institute in his church and many of the different churches that we were in fellowship with within the independent fundamental Baptist churches. It's like they thought he was like an oracle, honestly. Like he just
Yeah.
had some like super intelligent brain that he was able to give this information to people because nobody else could figure out certain things in the Bible. And he came up with his little, ideas and theories, and everybody was like, oh my gosh, he must be right. It's crazy.
The key to making Christians believe that you're a Bible expert is not to be a real expert, is to make sure you just have answers to their questions because they don't have answers to their questions, which means they can't tell if your answer is bunk. They have no
Right.
idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
So,
you've proved that time and time again on the debates that you do with Christians on your lives and on YouTube and TikTok and stuff. And I'm just like, you just ask basic questions to them and they cannot even answer. It's sometimes it's embarrassing. It's like, oh my gosh, like, do you not like have you not why would you call, like, this is what I always say, like, why would this individual call you, like, the Bible backwards and forward, like, the Bible, you've studied history, context, Greek and Hebrew, all this stuff. The average person doesn't, the average Christian doesn't, and then they're calling in trying to debate you, and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. I've never seen them win a debate over you. And so I just want to say one thing right here, just PSA, if you are a pastor or a quote unquote professor and you think you want to debate Justin, please contact me because I would love, love, love to have a debate on this podcast platform. Let's do it. Come on. Anyone
yeah.
has the cojones to do it. Let's do it.
So people get mad at me because I don't debate against like Bible professors and things like that. And the reason why isn't because I don't want to, it's because they agree with me. Most Bible professors know that they're believing things on faith and that it's not something you can debate or prove. And they're okay with that. So like a lot of the issues we talk about on stream, if any of my Bible professors got on a stream, they'd be like, yeah, but I'd take it on faith. And for a lot of people, that's okay. If that's how you live your life, I get it. That's great for you. It doesn't work for me. But if you live your life like that and you think I'm the asshole for not living my life like that, now we've got a problem. Listen,
Yeah.
I'm not required to live my life on faith. I want to live my life on things that make sense and have evidence to support them. But a lot of Christians really believe that their faith is true and they can prove it and they're not just taking it on faith. And those are the ones who walk into my live stream.
And that's funny because the people that say, "Oh, well, I can't really give you an answer; it's just by faith." Well, that isn't that's not an answer. That's a
Mhm.
cop out because even the Bible says that you should always be ready and able to give an answer to those who ask of you. So it's
Right.
like, okay, well, you can't just say by faith. That's not an answer, you
It's
know.
not.
So
Yeah, First Peter 3:15. You got to know it. You have to be
yeah,
ready. Hmm.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's what the Bible says. Anyways, I had to say that about Ruckman. I just had to throw that in because I'm like,
I
I
love it.
cannot believe it. I cannot believe he put silly asses in here. But he's also got the N word in here. He's got some other
Oh
derogatory language. Oh,
no.
yes, yes. And this was gifted to my husband from my dad.
Oh my gosh.
when we got married. So yeah. So we were like, we were in church one day. We don't go to church anymore, but when we were going to church, we were in church one day, and the pastor wasn't even speaking on this particular passage, but my husband was reading like the little footnote, and he like gasped all of a sudden, and I looked over and he goes, "Oh my gosh, read this." And I was like, "What?" And it was so derogatory. I was like, "Yep." I go, "That was Ruckman. He would say words like that from the pulpit." Like there's YouTube videos. I just did an episode with David on, and we did sermon clips. And I had one of Ruckman, and he was saying the N word. And
Is there only one edition of that Bible? Because I'm gonna get. We'll talk after the stream. I'm
yeah,
gonna get a copy of it. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Well, let's grab our next one. I think this might be our last. What I'm gonna call just. Hey, they made a blunder in the mistranslation. Genesis 1:28, and this is a popular one. You've heard of this. Says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it." Well,
Mhm.
the reality of this phrase is there's nothing about this phrase that would lead one to believe that it means replenish. And everything we know about the earth in Genesis was that there were no humans on the planet. So the word replenish means that it had been depleted and then it needed to be repopulated. But if they're the
Mhm.
first humans, that's not going to happen. The root word in question is Malay, and the way it shows up in the text right here is or umleu, which doesn't mean to replenish. It's being used as a verb to just fill, to fill up. And so, and what's it going to fill up? Et haeretz, the earth. So he says, be fruitful and multiply. That's ervu means to be like multiplied, and then fill the earth. Easy, nothing difficult. Like you could translate this in your second semester of Hebrew class. It's not a difficult sentence. And then what we find, if you look deep enough, you will find that there is a way to use this root word to say replenish. It shows up in the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't show up in Genesis 1:28. Now, in English, we would say the word fill could mean replenish if you add re to it. Refill means to replenish. Hebrew has a modifier as well, as it turns out. So you can add a modifier to the sentence and it would mean to refill, just like it does in English. And the modifier that you're going to need, I've got down here on the slideshow, it's likadesh, which means new. So this is the word kadesh means to renew or to new. And this lamed is not important to the sentence right now, probably an infinitive. But the way this would be translated then is to renew is the way you would translate that. But this root word, Malay, cannot mean renew until you add in the modifier, just like English. So the reality is the way it's used within the text of Genesis 1 mandates that it only means fill, because we know specifically from Hebrew grammar, from the rest of the Hebrew Bible, that if you want it to mean replenish, you have to add the modifier to it, just like we do. So they goofed. We didn't have to replenish the earth.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it makes it seem like there were humans before if he's saying replenish the earth, right?
Hmm.
But, and I've heard of people saying that the Garden of Eden was just a small area and that there were other humans already on the planet, which, I mean, I'm not opposed to that thought, but because I have some really kind of crazy thoughts about Adam and Eve and that aren't like in line with how I was thought, like how I was taught in church or Bible college or anything. And I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me, but that doesn't go in line with like the first part of chapter 1, where it was like, okay, here's this ball of nothing, that there's nothing that exists on it. It was without form and void, right? And then creation week happens, and then Adam and Eve were created, and all of this stuff. So it doesn't really go along with that thought of, well, if there was nothing here, then how can you replenish the earth from something that wasn't needing to be replenished. There was nothing there to replenish.
There are
So,
certainly a lot of a lot of people who believe that because the King James Bible says replenish, there must have been humans before Adam and Eve that were like wiped out. God had to reset like a flood and repopulate. The rest of the Bible treats Adam and Eve like the first human beings. That seems
mhm,
to be the case. In fact, original sin only works if they're the only human beings on the planet at the time they
right.
sinned, because then, in fact, the seed that's contaminated by their sin can't spread to all humanity if they don't all come from Adam and Eve. We'll find that hinted at in Romans chapter 5 and in Hebrews chapter 7. But
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
you get into some interesting theories with Adam and Eve for sure.
So, nevertheless, if your Bible says replenish, I mean, it's just wrong. And, it is what it is. Actually, I apologize. I had one more translation error before we get into some other fun stuff. This is from Deuteronomy 24:4. Heck, I might have another one after this. Thou shalt not cause the land to sin. This is an easy one. Which the Lord thy God giveth thee for inheritance. So the problem is the phrase, cause the land to sin. Well, land can't sin. It's being used in a verb here. Humans can sin. Land cannot sin. Land is not sentient. So the KJV phrasing is just not good. And the Hebrew phrase over here, velo takati, what this means is to become defiled, or I mean, to cause something to become defiled. So what we find in Hebrew is that there's verbal stems. Like we might have a verb. You know how we change verbs for past, present, and future? Go, going, went, things like that. So in Hebrew, they have the same thing, but they have a special stem. Their two stems are considered causative, meaning they're specifically connotating causation. So you might say, he caused to throw the ball. It just means, well, whatever's happening, the subject of the sentence is causing it to happen. This is what's happening, right?
Mhm,
And so what we find here is this is a second person, or this is a not a second person. This is a verb in the hafil verbal stem, causative stem, saying that you shall not cause the land to sin or to become defiled. So you shall not cause is actually what we're going to find here. The you would be second person actually. And if you're not going to cause something, that means the you is the causation, not the land. So if it said the land to sin, we would find somehow we would have to reference probably, I don't know, in the third singular person for the land, because the land would be a third person reference. But we don't find that here. It just means you shall not cause the land become defiled. And almost all translations read that way. Only the King James has this nonsense. Well, at least in the modern age. It should read, you shall not bring guilt on the land or defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession. So that's all it should read. It's not a difficult translation, but unfortunately the this is one case where the King James translators, I don't know what caused the mistake. Sometimes you know what causes the mistake. You can see like, oh, I see how they would come to that conclusion, even though that
mhm,
conclusion isn't correct. On this particular case, I don't know what it was they were doing that led to this mistake because it's not a mistake that I would expect. And the rest of the verse, if you read the whole verse, it talks
mhm,
about the land becoming defiled. The whole passage is about being defiled. One about wives, and the second
mhm.
part of the passage is talking specifically about the land. Don't defile yourselves through what you're doing with your marriages, and so also don't defile the land. And so that's why this second person causative stem here could only mean that the people are the ones causing the sin to be upon the land. The land itself is not sinning. That's preposterous.
Right.
And then the last translation error, I pulled one from the New Testament, and this is one of my favorites. I don't think we ever get to talk about this in debate, but this is akin to editorializing. Hebrews 4:8 says, "For if Jesus had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day." And in the Greek text, we do find Isu. So you think to yourself, oh, well, it must be about Jesus. It's not. If you're reading Hebrews chapter 3 and Hebrews chapter 4, it starts talking about how the Israelites never made it to the actual rest that they were promised. In fact, some of them made it to the promised land, but they didn't get the full promise of rest. So it was about how Joshua and Moses actually failed. Not failed, but they didn't see the full promise. The full promise of rest came through Jesus. And so when they got to Hebrews 4:8, they thought, oh, is this Joshua or Jesus? Because Jesus' name in the original Hebrew would have been Yehoshua, which is the name of Joshua in English.
Mm-hmm.
So in the New Testament, sometimes you see the word Isu and you have to think to yourself, did they mean Joshua, like the successor of Moses, or did they mean Joshua, like the guy from Nazareth? And they got it wrong here. They put Jesus of Nazareth in Hebrews 4:8 when it was clearly supposed to be Joshua, the one who came after Moses, the one who was supposed to be leading them into the promised land and giving them rest, which they didn't have. So either they made a mistake or they were trying to make a theological point about Jesus. Because every other instance where we find Isu, speaking of Joshua in the New Testament, like the figure Joshua of the Old Testament, they just write the English will just say Joshua rather than Jesus.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
they decided for whatever reason to put Jesus in here when it should have been Joshua. I understand why they did it. They probably thought that it was a theological point that was important, and unfortunately, they goofed.
That's interesting.
But leading into editorializing, I've got three examples of my favorite ways the King James translators made purposeful translation decisions because they wanted it to be viewed a particular way. And the first one is to, and you probably know this one, to retain Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12. So what it reads in King James is, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" But that's not what it says. In Hebrew, it doesn't say that at all. It says Eich or Nefalta, and then Mishma'i Hillel ben Shakar. And the phrase Hillel ben Shakar is the one in question. They translate this as O Lucifer, son of the morning, but that's not what it says. What it should say is son of the morning or son of the dawn. So Ben Shakar would be son of the dawn. Ben is Hebrew for son. Shakar is like the dawn or the dusk. And Hillel is actually, as far as we can tell, like the name of an ancient Near Eastern deity, but it gets translated as light bearer. So
Mm-hmm.
it should read light bearer, son of the dawn. And this is kind of a reference to the mythology of the time period. Got to remember, this was written to the Babylonian king. So every reference in here should be understandable to the Babylonian king. And so Hillel ben Shakar is like riffing on this ancient myth that was known in the northern Babylonian kingdom, like around Syria and Assyria. This is the tale of Athtar. You can read about Athtar's great fall from the throne. He's on the Mount of Assembly, on Mount Zaphon, and Baal, the king of Mount Zaphon, is in the underworld. He's deceased, and the mother of Athtar, who is associated with the planet Venus, also called the morning star, says, "Hey, put my son Athtar on the throne in place of Baal." And he gets up there. He's not tall enough to even reach the footstool, and he becomes a laughing stock because he's not kingly enough. And they cast him off of the throne in embarrassment. So he doesn't rise above the other stars of the gods. He becomes a laughing stock for the people. And this is really what this is referring to. He's making fun of the king of Babylon, referencing this other mythological tale that he certainly would have known about. There's nothing in here about Satan and or Lucifer. Lucifer is a Latin word. It's the Latin word for Hillel. It just means light bearer, that's all. But because in 1611 it was already common, it was common thought and accepted that Lucifer meant the devil. It meant Satan. And so, like, oh no, when we translate this into English, we need people to know that this is about Satan. So we're going to leave Lucifer in the text, even though Lucifer is not an English word, it's a Latin word of the Hebrew Hallel. That way, people who already think that Lucifer is Satan won't forget that, oh, yeah, this is about Satan. So this is the type of editorializing we find in the Bible because they had a theological mindset that they weren't willing to risk. They needed you to believe certain theological positions. Another one, which I think is worse, is what they do with the word sodomite in the King James. And
I was going to bring that up, and I'm glad you did. Yeah. Okay.
oh yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about this.
Oof. So it was kind of an idiom during the time of 1611 to just refer to somebody who was a homosexual. Now, the reality is it was really only used of men. It wasn't typically used of women, although certainly there might be cases of it. I haven't seen one. But what we find is that in the Hebrew text, there are instances of the word sodomite being used. What we find in the King James is sometimes they use sodomite where it doesn't exist in the Hebrew text because they want you to believe that this is a reference to a gay person and they think sodomite is the way to say a gay person at that time period. But that's not really what the text says. So one example is Deuteronomy 23:17, where it says, "There shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel." This sounds like it would just be a prohibition against all male homosexuality. That's what it sounds like in the King James, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not what it actually means. So in the Hebrew, we've got two phrases, and I put them in parallel because they show up in parallel in Hebrew. And we have Kedeshah, and then we have Kadesh. And what this is referring to, the first one just means like a female shrine prostitute. So kadosh means holy. Kadesh could be a holy thing, or typically they would refer to it as like the holy place. So we find that in the book of Daniel, or in quite a few places where it refers to the Holy of Holies.
Mm-hmm.
It uses this root word, kadosh, to refer to the holy place. But it also referred to people who worked in the holy place. You could be a holy one, and it would be the same word. So the feminine form for a holy one is actually slang for a female temple prostitute, which means when it shows up here, it's also slang for a male temple prostitute because the only difference in these two phrasings is one is feminine and one is masculine. So it should read there should be no female there should be no female prostitute of the daughters of Israel, nor a male prostitute of the sons of Israel, specifically referring to those who attend at the temple. This is not a prohibition against male relationships. That's not what
Mm-hmm.
this is. But the
Mm-hmm.
King James Bible translators wanted you to think that it was. And so they put sodomite in there, even though the text does not say sodomite. It's not in there.
Yeah. You know what was always weird to me too, just even like growing up, I just have very basic questions about things. And one of the things that of course they preached against, homosexuality, and they always use Sodom and Gomorrah as, the example that they would say, the Bible says it's an abomination and, whatever. And I'm reading like David and Jonathan, they had a relationship, and anytime that I would bring that up, they would be like, "Oh no, they were just friends." I'm like, "No, they kissed." I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just saying. I mean, I don't really know any guys that kiss unless they're like together.
David and Jonathan is a difficult story, and so I can give you some of my history. So I used to be married to an Egyptian, and I can tell you that even today, a lot of cultures in the Near East, they do kiss on the cheek, sometimes
Mhm.
on the neck when they do greetings. It's very common in the ancient Near East. You see it all over the place. In fact, when Esau and his brother Jacob reunite, it says they fell upon each other's necks and kissed, right? So there's this idea in the ancient world that it's not always sexual when it happens. But my reading of the David and Jonathan story is I think Jonathan had a thing for David. I don't think David had a thing for Jonathan. Now it does say that he had a greater love for Jonathan than any of his wives, which is a really weird statement for a male to make. But I think Jonathan was even greater than that. I think Jonathan would have gave his life for
Sure.
David, and I really think because he even betrayed his own father to save David. I
Hmm.
think Jonathan, even though the text doesn't say it, may have had some relationship with David, but I don't know if David reciprocated or it was reciprocal because in ancient warfare culture, the bond between men was often like it was heroic, right? It was um, it was so bound up in heroism that even away from war, your bond with another man was like imagined as like the pinnacle of human relationships. Whereas your relationship with a woman was more of like you and your property. That makes
Hmm.
sense. Because remember, women weren't really considered to be all that equal with men.
Hmm.
So your relationships between men were more or less idolized than the relationships with women. Women were kind of seen as a tool for sexual gratification most of the time. And so it's hard exactly to parse out the wording of the Bible to know, hey, were these dudes like were they kicking boots or what? Because
Yeah.
it's surprisingly ambiguous, but
Yeah.
I personally don't think that they were getting down that way, but I wouldn't rule it out. We'll say
Yeah.
that.
I just always was curious. I'm like, there's some undertones, and but we weren't allowed to think that way. Like we weren't. But I'm like, yeah, but it says this, and it's inferring that, and it's like, oh no, no, that would
Yeah, it's
never.
tough.
But then it's like, then you take David too, and it's like the Bible says he was a man of God's own heart, and he did all the
Hmm.
things that he did, and it's like, okay, that's an interesting comparison. I had a lot of questions growing up.
And that's why we're not Christians anymore. It's because we had too many questions
A lot of questions that
and
cannot be answered.
you got it. That's right. So there's another interesting, and I'm sure you know about this one. It's one of the most famous, maybe the most famous editorializing in the King James Bible, which is from Acts 12:4, where it says, "And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to four this is a tough one for me, quaternions, there we go. I hope I said that right, of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people." Let's be honest. Easter did not exist in this time period. It wasn't a thing. Now, King James onlyists will say, well, yeah, this refers to the pagan holiday, worshiping Ishtar. That's not a thing that existed either. The feast day of Ishtar in Babylonian culture, not in Roman culture. Romans didn't care about Ishtar. The feast day for Ishtar was in the fall. It was a harvest time festival. She was not worshipped in the springtime anywhere near Pascha or the Passover. The Greek text actually says Pascha. That's every time it shows up in the Greek, it gets translated as Passover. It should be translated as Passover here. It wasn't until Constantine that Christians stopped celebrating Passover and they decided to call it something else. So for the first 300 years of the church, they just had Passover, slightly different than what the Jewish people held. It was the same festival. They just had their own way of doing it, and that was fine. That was fine. They didn't call it Easter. There's no reason to put Easter in here. There's a lot of different defenses about why they chose to put Easter here, but the reality is it has no business being in this text. It's not what was intended by the author. The author did not mean to say that the king or Herod waited until after Easter, a Christian holiday, to kill one of these people. It's clear by the text that they waited until after the Jewish holiday was over to do it, as to not offend the Jewish people. There was no king of the Christians. He was killing the Christians. He doesn't care about them. That's not any of concern of his to worry about when Easter was.
Yeah. So as you're talking and saying this, I'm like, okay, I wonder what Dr. Peter Ruckman would.
Oh no.
Okay, I can't. Oh, so he said the word Easter is supposed to be a famous quote unquote mistake and mistranslation in the King James Bible. However, the word was used by both Luther and Tyndale more than 90 years before the KJV showed up. Both of them called Jesus Christ, quote, our Easter lamb in 1 Corinthians 5:7. In fact, the Greek word, and I'm going to totally botch this, I'm sure, but the Greek word pascha, Pascha.
It's typically pronounced Pascha in
Okay.
the pronunciation.
Okay, is the word used here by Greek speaking Greeks for Easter. This is known as, quote, dynamic equivalence, as practiced by every version on the market, especially the NIV, whose apostate translators refuse to translate more than 1,000 words literally. In those few places where the KJV used this technique, all the religious hypocrites complain bitterly. The reason every English translation is up to the AV retained the reading Easter here is because the translation, quote, Passover, would be a bold-faced lie and a real contradiction in the scriptures. Easter here occurred during the days, plural, of unleavened bread, verse 3. It was not the, quote, day, singular, of unleavened bread, which was the Passover, Luke 22:7, Matthew 26:17. It was the, quote, 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Leviticus 23:6, Exodus 12, verses 15 through 18, which followed Passover. Passover was over and done with by verse 3. The Easter of this verse is a pagan feast named after, which you just went over. And then he says, Ishtar, blah, blah, blah. It was a feast observed by Herod, verse 1, who was a Roman Edomite. He was intending to execute Peter after the observance of his own religious festival because obviously the Romans had no problem with executing a criminal on the Jewish's feast day because Jesus Christ was crucified on Passover. That's what his explanation of that verse was, of
And
Easter.
the problem actually is the Jewish people didn't want people to be executed on their feast day, and this is actually quite explicit within the text. In fact, let me find, I think it's John 19, John 18:28, I think is the one I'm looking for. They make it a point to indicate that, hey, we can't kill somebody during the Passover. In fact, yeah,
Oh,
John
yeah.
18:28 says, and they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So even engaging in the trial during this time period was sketchy, and that's why the Romans were really in charge of all this. And if you read up, leading up to the Last Supper, it talks, in fact, about how the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees were like intending to capture him after the Passover. Like they're busy preparing for the Passover, but because it's coming, we have to worry about that first. We can't arrest him just yet. So let me grab. I want to say in Matthew, we have, let's say, Matthew 26 is probably the chapter I'm looking for. It says the chief priest, 26:3, the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the courtyard, high priest who was, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, but they said not during the festival, or there may be a riot. So the Jewish people were not interested even in killing the greatest of heretics during the festival of Passover. And calling it Pascha was not referring to a single day of the days of unleavened bread. It referred to the entire celebration. We have multiple instances in the Bible of Pascha referring to the entire festival. It doesn't mean like the Paschal meal. It's not a reference for one single individual event. So that being said, Ruckman's explanation is wrong. He's asserting things without evidence. There's no evidence that Pascha meant a single day. There's no evidence that Herod ever practiced anything remotely akin to Easter, and there's zero evidence. In fact, I wrote a blog post on this many years ago. I went through all of the extant ancient Near Eastern texts that mentioned Ishtar, Astarte, and Inanna. Those are all names for the same goddess. And I
Mhm.
documented when her activities were, what symbols were associated with her, and what people did in celebrating her on the earth. And it turns out she's not associated with any Easter eggs, no bunnies. She's not a springtime goddess, and nobody did anything remotely related to Easter festivals like the springtime new life rituals and things like that. None of that was remotely related to this goddess because she ceased to be worshipped by the time the Romans were putting people to death. She was
Mhm.
irrelevant. She was a footnote in history. They didn't care about her. So Easter, while it sounds like Ishtar, it is not related to Ishtar. In fact, the best reference we have is from the ninth century from the Honorable Bede, who documents that it probably is a derivative of Hostre, which is a Northern European, like Germanic deity that was a goddess of the springtime. And that's where the Easter celebration got its name, was from actually ninth, or well, earlier than ninth century, but we learn about it in the ninth century from some European deity after Christianity already spread and intermingled with European pagan rites. Had nothing
Hmm.
to do with the goddess Ishtar.
It sounds similar. That's probably where they get it from.
I know. Yeah, but there's not a single, and you can quote me on this. Anyone who wants to put me to the test, there's not a single ancient Near Eastern document, not one of them, that mentions this goddess that has anything to say about a springtime fertility festival that even remotely resembles Easter or Passover. It's just they're not related. So he's twisting himself into pretzels to defend the King James rather than being honest.
Right.
And I think my favorite dishonest passage in the King James, which I think is overt and it doesn't get brought up, is in Daniel 9. These are called, I call them Messianic Helpers. In Daniel 9, verse 25 and 26, this is like a quintessential Messianic prophecy, but they do some editing to it that makes it sound more Messianic. First of all, I don't think it's about the Messiah, but they do. And it says, from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. And then verse 26 says, 62 weeks shall be Messiah. I'm sorry, in 2 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. In both cases, one says the Messiah with a capital M, and one says Messiah with a capital M. Well, this means they're telling you, well, this is a reference to Jesus. It's God. That's why you need the capital. Well, there's no capitals in Hebrew. They didn't say Messiah capital. It says anointed one, and it doesn't say the with a definite article. It says a anointed leader, and then after that it says a anointed one shall be cut off, meaning there are two different anointed ones. And by the way, they're separated by 62 weeks, weeks of years, which means there are over 400 years between these two individuals being alive. They are not the same person. This passage is not talking about the Messiah. They're simply not the same. In fact, I put the text down here. You'll find ad Mashiach, which means until a anointed one. And then here is which is he shall be cut off or he shall be cut, and Messiah is the object. So the Messiah shall be cut, or a Messiah shall be cut. So if it was going to say the Messiah, it should say HaMashiach. It doesn't say HaMashiach, it just says Mashiach, which means anyone who's anointed, a priest, a king, whoever. And almost the entirety of scholarly consensus has been that this is a reference to the high priest Joshua number one and a reference to the high priest Onias III in the second reference. There are two different people separated by a large span of time. Joshua was anointed high priest in like 516 after the rebuilding of the temple. Onias III was the high priest that was deposed and killed during the Antiochian crisis. And this passage is a giant reference to the Antiochian crisis. It has nothing to do with Jesus whatsoever. But in order to help you think that it's about Jesus, they made sure to include the Messiah in all capitals just so you thought about Jesus when you read it. This is them being dishonest. They're not doing a translation, they're trying to get you to believe their theology. And
It's
then,
interesting because I had somebody say, you better be careful deconstructing because that is dangerous. And dangerous meaning that truth I might become aware of, like actual truth, and not just, hey, this is how I was raised and this is what I was taught and this is what I always thought. And I'm peeling back the layers of truth and realizing that there may be more to some things that I thought, and that's
right.
deconstructing. You're coming to an awareness, and that's dangerous, Justin.
Yeah, don't educate yourself. Stay stupid.
Yeah.
Stay programmed. I wanted to include some information on why the King James is problematic because we have learned more about how to translate words than when we knew in 1611. And two really good examples about the goddess Asherah. She's really popular nowadays. Well, the reality was in 1611, they didn't know who Asherah was. She shows up over 40 times in the Hebrew Bible, clearly as a female goddess. She was well known to people of the ancient times, but they kind of lost sight of it. Around the turn of the 19th century, we started to get archaeological finds where people discovered Ugaritic tablets, they discovered Akkadian tablets, they discovered all kinds of Phoenician writings, and they discovered that hey, there's this figure that shows up named Asherah. But the problem was, prior to discovering all these tablets, well, they didn't know what to do with it. And so they're translating Asherah often as a grove of trees. And so, for example, it says in Micah 5:14 through 15, I will pluck up thy groves out of the midst of thee, and I will destroy thy cities, and I will execute vengeance and anger and fury upon the heathen. Well, if you read Micah, this is right in line with him talking about how he's upset about these idols. Like, why is he upset with all these trees? What are you talking about? Does God hate trees? No. The Asherim were not trees. They were female idols of the god Asherah. And the reality is they didn't know what to do with this word. They didn't understand how it functioned. But once we discovered all these new tablets and documents where we now knew that this wasn't a tree or a grove of trees. This was the name of a female deity who her worship was associated with trees, to be sure. The root word of her name gives that out. But now we just know. We know in the Bible where it says Asherah, and we put it in there. But in the King James, she didn't show up once. She's not to be found. Every time you find that individual pagan deity, it just says a tree or a grove of trees. It's preposterous if you read it because it makes no sense.
Wow. Okay, so it's actually this goddess deity when it
Mhm.
says the groves. Wow.
Yeah, God's not mad at trees.
No, and also I would like to just point out that there's a lot of like female things that are removed from the King James Bible.
Oh yeah,
That tells me a lot.
it really does.
Yeah.
And in line with Asherah, there's also like a host of other ancient Near Eastern demons that they didn't know what to do with in Hebrew. And even some of the Greek translators had a little bit of trouble with them. So what they did in 1611 is they took the words in Hebrew and they kind of translated them into English using what they knew about Greek mythology as their guide. And then later, when we discovered all the evidence and documents from the ancient Near East, and we got a better idea about what kind of demons or deities these were, Now we get better translations. So I'll give you the example. So Isaiah 34, 13 through 14. This is a really interesting passage. It says, "And thorns shall come up in her places, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof, and it shall be an habitation of dragons." We're in the King James. So it says there's going to be dragons and a court of owls. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island. And the satyr shall cry to his fellow, the screech owl also shall rest there and find herself a place of rest. So, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, what is a satyr? What is a dragon? Seems like we're talking about some like mythological creatures. And what we know now is that in the ancient Near East, they believed that a lot of these demonic would live in the deserts and they would wait for people in the deserts to attack, but they would often take the form of an animal. So we find stories of like Lilith turning into a bird. We find all kinds of stories about these ancient Near Eastern deities just taking the form of the animal and then doing their stuff. So what we find now, like a modern translation, would read something akin to wildcats shall meet with hyenas, goat demons shall call to each other, and there Lilith shall repose and find a place to rest. Lilith, the actual female deity Lilith that was cut out for so long from our documentation, finds her home finally. She's vindicated because now we have new data from the ancient world that we know that the root Lilith probably should be referred to as Lilith and not a screech owl. That's not the way it should be understood, because it used to be that this chapter was, it seemed like it was either a like Greek mythological figures or real animals. And then
Mm.
what we know now is actually they're not Greek mythological figures, they're ancient Near Eastern mythological demons that are taking the form of animals. So there's no satyr. That's not a thing that, and there's no dragon. Those don't exist. And so the reality is now you can go to Isaiah and understand better what he was talking about. And remember earlier the talk about Hillel ben Shakar being Lucifer? That's
Mhm.
also in Isaiah. Isaiah, first Isaiah specifically, knew ancient Near Eastern mythology so well. He references ancient Near Eastern mythology over and over and over again, and you wouldn't know it unless you read ancient Near Eastern mythology, which I got to do when I was in school. And the people who were reading the King James Bible, they didn't have it available to them. They didn't know. So when they picked up Isaiah and were going through it, there was a lot of ancient Near Eastern words in there that they didn't know what to do with because they didn't have the requisite background to translate them because archaeology hadn't happened yet. George Smith didn't exist. We didn't have people doing it. So it's not that they were stupid. As I said before, we have better information today than they had back then, which is why we know that goat demons and Lilith belong in Isaiah, as does Asherah. They didn't know it.
Wow, that's interesting.
And then those are the end of my translation issues. I've got a couple phrases, though. I want to illustrate one point because you were told, like me, the King James Bible is like a fifth grade reading level. Fifth graders can read it. Well,
Yeah.
that's a lie.
Yeah.
And I used to bring out all kinds of statistics and demonstrate how the test that they did was flawed and how actually it's all a lie. But now it's just easier to do this. I have a list of words. Tell me if you know what these mean without reading off the page. Agwe, nothing. Bishopric, troller, daysman, descry, fellows. No one knows these words, but
Right.
they're all in the King James Bible. And agwe is a fever. A bishopric is an overseer of a diocese. They didn't have diocese in Acts chapter 1. A
Right.
troller just means anger. Daysman is an umpire or a judge or an arbiter. How would anyone know these words? Like because we don't use them anymore. That's
Yeah.
why it's why we have newer revisions with words that we actually understand. There's no need for this. And you've probably heard it said, that's fine because you need to study yourself to show yourself approved. You need to
Oh,
learn these
yeah.
archaic words, or else you're not a real Christian. But like, listen, if you have to go and learn another language to read this book, just go back and read the Greek and Hebrew. Learn those languages.
Yeah,
Those are
you can't
what are we
though. They would
doing?
say if you don't know a word, you can look it up in the Webster's 1880 Webster's dictionary.
Right.
They even had the specific year of the dictionary edition that you could go and reference. It's like, okay, I give up. It just never made sense to me.
When I was a Christian, nothing drove me more insane than King James Onlyists because it didn't make sense to me. Like
Yeah.
why would out of all the English translations we be beholden to just this one specific English translation? And why would the Holy Spirit be like, "Oh yeah, these other English translations are garbage, but this specific one we're going to use forever." How long are we going to do it? Eventually, none of these words, like in another 2000 years, no one's going to be able to read any of this.
Yeah, I agree. And so a book that was always referenced as like a study, to study the King James
Oh
against
no.
other versions.
Not Gail Riplinger. Don't say Gail
Yeah,
Riplinger. No.
you knew
Another
I was going to say
unagented
that.
clown.
Gail Riplinger, I mean, it just shows side by side all the translations against the KJV, and look at all these translations they add or they take out of all these different verses, and this proves that was like that was their proof. That was their proof to everything. If you ever questioned them being King James only, you needed to read Gail Riplinger's book.
Yeah. Keep in mind, Gail Riplinger has no expertise in biblical studies. She doesn't know anything about the manuscripts. She doesn't know Greek or Hebrew. In fact, she says that the information for her book, she got from God. It was inspired by the Holy Spirit. It wasn't through anything that she learned, which is certainly the cop out I would use if I put together a book that was
Sure.
largely incoherent, that was like just mostly a collection of shower thoughts and like bad layouts of verses.
I knew you would love that.
Yeah, roughly. I'll never understand the King James onlyist movements, their reliance on people with no training or expertise whatsoever in the topic that they're experts on. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, same. Okay, so we got some listener questions because
Right.
I put out a little box on social media and asked if you have a question about the King James or King James himself or whatever. So I got a couple of questions for you. So one listener asked if the King James is not the best version for modern day, what other version would you recommend?
I think there are three really good versions. My favorite is probably the NRSV updated edition. Most of the new study Bibles are all going to be in that. In fact, the new Oxford Annotated Study Bible is in the NRSV. The sixth edition will be in the NRSV updated. That's coming out this spring. The Catholic Study Bible is going to be on the list as well. The Westminster Study Bible and the SBL Study Bible are both NRSV updated edition because almost all the academics agree that's probably the best one. Now, in second place is going to be the NABRE, the New American Bible Revised Edition. And this is heavily used by the Catholics. So the Catholic Study Bible, which is an academic study Bible, uses that exact translation. I love it. It's very comparable to the NRSV, and there's some cases where I like it better. In third place, I would add the Net Bible, but with one caveat. So the Net Bible is a good translation, but if you're going to get one, the only one you should ever get is the Net Bible with full notes. Get one that says with full notes, because this is a real study Bible. And what they do is they have the verse on the page right here, and then everything surrounding the verse are study notes as to how they came to their translation. They're all translational notes saying, hey, this is why our translation says this and why it might differ from these other ones. And the good news is they made it for lay people, which means you don't need to know Greek, you don't need to know Hebrew, to read any of these study notes and see why they made the decisions that they made. And sometimes it differs from the NRSV or the NABRE, but very minor differences, not very often, and they give very full explanations for why it differs.
I know quite a few people who use the ESV and the RSV. Like it, what do you think about either one of those translations?
So the RSV is a precursor to the NRSV, and it was okay for the time period. We have better now. The RSV is too old to be relevant. In fact, if you were in Bible college or seminary and you were quoting out of the RSV, your professor would suggest that you use something more recent. It's outdated.
Hmm.
And the other one, well, I'm sorry, what was the other one?
The
Oh, the
ES,
ESV. The ESV is not bad. The newest iteration of the ESV I like a little bit better. My only complaint is so the people who are doing the ESV, they appear to have one, some theological motives, and two, they seem to be like really reformed in like for some reason the reformed movement, the Calvinists have decided that this was going to be their Bible translation. And so you'll find the study notes, the translation, a lot of it seems to be heavily biased towards like theological ends, more biased than what I would want. Now, I've got the ESV Study Bible, and I don't hate it. Okay, it's I don't want to say it's bad. If you're a Christian, if you still believe this book is divinely inspired, and you want a book, a study Bible that still believes that Jesus is Lord, this will get you there. This will be a good academic study Bible that still gets you to the goalpost of Jesus must be Lord and he fulfilled these prophecies. That being said, my main complaint is that this Bible engages in apologetics where it doesn't need to. It's not strictly academic, it's trying to toe the line. It doesn't want to deconvert people away from Christianity. In fact, the New Oxford Annotated Bible, people used to say it's the atheist Bible because the study notes will deconstruct you. And if no one on the New Oxford Committee is trying to make non-Christians. It just happens to be that if you're going to publish an academic study Bible, there's a certain line you have to keep. And that line is this study Bible isn't here to teach you theology, it's to teach you this is the current consensus of the field based on all the latest information we have. Whereas this one is like, we're going to do some of that, but we're also going to make sure that you won't like stop being a Christian.
yeah, you can't stray away from that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so here's another question. Was the creation and promotion of the King James fundamentally an effort by the Church of England to solidify its position and create an ecclesiastical monopoly over scriptural interpretation, effectively silencing dissenting voices?
That really is true. And we kind of touched on this earlier. King James needed an official Bible. That's why at the beginning of the Bible, it specifically says to be used in the churches, meaning once this thing is published, every church in England will have this in the pew. The goal
Mhm.
is to have an official Bible that you have some level of control over. And because if you don't need control, you could have said, "Hey, I don't know, put the bishops in there, put the Coverdale in there, put the Tyndale." Like you could have just said, "Listen, anything but the Geneva. Just put anything there but the Geneva," because he hated the Geneva, right? But he
Yeah.
didn't do that. He said, "No, no, 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 no. Certainly not the Geneva. Let's do our own official Bible, and this will become the official Bible." And the reason why you would want an official Bible is obviously because you want to control the conversation a little bit. You want to say, "Hey, here's what the authorized official Bible says." And then you can kind of slam your fist on the table and say, well, divine right says so.
Yeah, governments, they just, yeah, they've been controlling for a long time. So, I mean, I don't know why people think that the King James Bible is so great because it was authorized by a king. I think that makes it even worse.
Yeah, that doesn't help it. It hurts it.
That's what I think. That's the way I look at it. Just because I don't trust governments throughout the years anyway, throughout centuries history proves that time and time again with monarchs and dictators and all of that. So
Hmm.
I wouldn't say it as a badge of honor to be like, well, this is the Bible that was authorized by a king. That's kind of not a good thing. I don't know.
Can you think of a single dictator that anyone speaks of positively?
No, I can't.
There you go. There's
Yeah,
probably a reason for that.
I took French in college just as a class that I had to take. And I got a French Bible because, of course, I went to a Bible university, Bob Jones University. So you and I both know that when you are learning a new language from English to, say, Spanish or French, that there are words that can translate differently, things that might be lost in translation or have a different meaning in a different culture. And we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I know preachers who have a printing business where they will say, please support our Bible printing business. We translate these Bibles into other languages from the King James Version.
Oh,
So with that being said, it to me in the same vein of them saying like, oh, well, the King James is like the pure word of God. Well, then you're translating it into another language from the King James Version translation. Wouldn't that water it down or change certain things about it?
that's a good question because like if the let's imagine King James is now the let's just assume it's perfect. Okay. Not everyone speaks English, right? So when
Right.
we translate this into French, can we assume that translation is perfect? And they're not going to say, yeah. They're going to say, well, no, obviously there's going to be human error. And like they're never going to say that like the Spanish or the Latin or not the Latin, but the French is going to be perfect. So then you have to ask yourself, well, if it's not perfect, should all people in the world have to learn English? Is that the only way to get them to read a perfect Bible? Is that all human beings have to learn English? And the reality is that seems to be the only logical position they can take. Because if it's okay for them to read an imperfect French Bible, then that means it's okay to read an imperfect English Bible at that point. What are we doing here?
Yeah, and the explanation that I was always given to that was God chose the English language because he knew that that was going to be the primary language, the main language in
The new
the earth.
Israel.
Yeah, and I'm like, okay, yeah, totally makes sense. So poor French people, poor Spanish people, poor Greek people, everybody else, sorry, you're going to get a watered down version because the English
Yeah.
language is, unless you learn English, you ain't getting the full truth.
Was Ruckman a replacement theology guy? Did he believe that America replaced Israel?
So he would preach that America is Mystery Babylon.
Oh, okay. One of those. Gotcha. All right.
Yeah,
Oh
so
boy.
there's that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, yes, also I do think that he did preach that America was kind of a not an equal to Israel, but a similar, yeah.
Yeah.
I think he did, if I recall. Yeah.
Oh boy. Well,
He had a lot of crazy theories, honestly.
he's a special guy.
My final question, Justin, is for everyone that is just, they're listening to this and they're like, man, she has not asked this question yet. They're dying to know. What is your favorite pizza topping?
Okay, listen. Everyone watching this liked me until this moment, and that's okay. My favorite pizza topping is Hawaiian pizza with bacon and pineapple.
Oh, nice. Wow. I have not tried that.
It's so good.
Okay, when you said with the bacon, I thought that would actually be good with like a drizzle of barbecue sauce on top. Do you ever do that combo?
Yes, and shaved almonds.
You just took it a whole nother
I
level.
mean, it's unbelievable. There's only one pizza chain that has something similar to that. Donato's has it, and then I've had some at like smaller outlets that aren't big chains. But you can make it at home, and it's just as good as what the big pizza shops will sell you. But yeah, Hawaiian pizza all the way. I know there's some people who believe that pineapple don't belong on pizza. I get it. I'm a pizza heretic. I'll own it.
I love it. Okay, so where can the listeners find you? Because we definitely want people to find you to look up your YouTube videos and to watch the debates, the lives. They're so entertaining, you guys, and you will learn so much, I promise you.
So my main channel is Deconstruction Zone on TikTok and on YouTube. And on my main channel, I do the debates, but I also do like educational videos. I do interviews. I do crossovers with people. In fact, you were on there not that long ago. I have a second channel that I started earlier this year that is literally just for debates. Like if you like, listen, I want to hear this guy debate, but I don't care what he says on the weekend or any of these interviews. I just want to see a dude debate somebody. My second channel is debates only. It's called DZ Debates. And so either of those channels will get you to my debate content, but my main channel will get you all the other fun stuff.
I love it. And then people can find you on TikTok as well under the Deconstruction Zone as
Yep. I
well.
think it's deconstruction.zone on TikTok. And I don't think there's many copycats on TikTok. So if you just type in deconstruction zone on TikTok, you'll find my general face. I had a blast. Thanks for
It
having
was
me.
it was awesome. Thanks guys for listening, and we appreciate each and every one of you guys. Please go follow Justin Deconstruction Zone on social media and on YouTube, and we appreciate you all. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time. If this episode made you uncomfortable, curious, or even challenged something you've always believed, that's okay. Conversations like this aren't meant to hand you conclusions. They're meant to invite deeper thinking, more questions, and better understanding. What I appreciated most about today's discussion was the emphasis on evidence, context, and critical examination rather than blind acceptance. No matter where you land personally, understanding the origins and the evolution of sacred texts give us the ability to engage with them more honestly and intentionally. If you found this episode valuable, please consider sharing it with somebody who enjoys thoughtful discussions or is interested in biblical history and translations. And if you have questions, reflections, or topics you'd like for us to explore in future episodes, I would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being opened, and I'll see you in the next episode. Before we close out, I just want to share a quick reminder. The stories told on this podcast are personal experiences and perspectives. They're shared to create awareness and connection, not as medical, legal, or mental health advice. Some of the conversations here focus on abuse, trauma, and other heavy topics, so please take care of yourself while listening. It's always okay to pause, skip an episode, or step away if you need to. And if anything we talked about brings something up to you, we encourage you to reach out to a trusted professional or a support resource. You don't have to carry any of this alone. Thank you for listening.